crew because we'd already taken the ship out to sea for a shakedown. We knew the ship was seaworthy. They wanted to be sure it was because they intended to literally ship it out immediately and start outfitting other ships because they'd already built up something like 10 sets of spare equipment, so we're ready to go. And the crew goes on board, and in the movie they say it was in October. They showed them wearing pea jackets, which meant it was a cool day. It was not. It was in summer. It was in August. It was a hot day. It gets quite hot in Philly in the summer. And we went downriver about 6 miles, and the test was conducted there. Now, in the movie, they don't show exactly where the test was conducted, but they did not show it being conducted in the Navy Yard. It was not. And that part was correct. But they show it going downriver, and, of course, turning on the equipment. And then the ship, of course, disappearing completely. And then on board, they did show, quite correctly, that Duncan and I running the equipment. They showed the two guys running the equipment, which was Duncan and myself in the movie. They didn't show them as Duncan and my brother, but as the two guys actually who were set up to run the equipment. In the movie, they showed them as enlisted. Actually, as a matter of fact, we were both officers. They wanted the two guys running the equipment who were fully versed in the equipment, knew the theory, knew what it was supposed to do, and if something went wrong, maybe could figure out what to do to make it work right. Well, that was our problem. It started to go haywire on the second test. First test, everything worked fine, except for the side effects on the personnel. The second test on 12 August, everything went wrong within a short period of time. In terms of what we saw and what we experienced on board the ship, after about 30 seconds, we saw strange things like the vacuum tubes glowing unevenly, getting brighter and dimmer, which you don't do unless you up the filament voltage enormously, like from the normal 6.3 to about 8.5, 9, which would do it, or drop it to 3 volts would make it dim. It appeared that something like that was happening. We had no idea what was going on. But then we got a whole series of phenomena like high voltage arc overs, except there was no high voltage equipment in the room. In retrospect, I looked at that as something starting to develop from another domain because I didn't know, Duncan didn't know at that point, that the ship was already out of the harbor in hyperspace. And what we were experiencing was the side effects of going into hyperspace. We were getting what appeared to be high voltage arc overs in the control room, and it wasn't high voltage, it was etheric energy arc overs of some type, which we could not explain then and could not explain now for that matter. But it kept getting worse, and we couldn't shut the equipment off. All of the control, every control was locked. We couldn't budge them.
Okay, now we covered all of that in the Philadelphia experiment. I'd like to go back, however, to that original question which I had about your memories. How were you able to discern, or what was the process of these memories coming back? Are you going to get to that?
Okay, the first thing which jogged memory was that last night out in the bar. Even though I was not in there the last night, it was a familiar scene, the dancing and everything else. Boarding the ship was not of itself especially memory jogging, but seeing the ship at dockside was. Going in the control room definitely was memory jogging, and showing the failure of the equipment or whatever was going on, something was going wrong, and we ran out of the room. That definitely brought memories back, because that's exactly what happened. And then when we jumped overboard, that was exactly what happened. But of course, like in reality, as in the movie, we never hit the water. That was real, and that was a jogging of the memory. Hitting the underground, which actually in the sequence of the movie didn't happen immediately. It was long after this chase, and the whole scenario I won't go through for the movie. But eventually getting to the underground and seeing the old man, Dr. von Neumann, that also was memory jogging. But at that point, I realized it started to overwhelm me, and I started to feel I've been involved in this before, I've seen this before. And it started to surface. It didn't all surface at once. It actually came back over the next 48 to 72 hours. The next day, I remembered something which von Neumann had told me. I remembered I had a family. B, I had a son, which I had no memory up to that point, to the point of seeing the movie that night. And I was not in the movie either. C, von Neumann told me that if I ever remembered my involvement in the Philadelphia experiment, he would try to call me within 72 hours. It was 48 hours after that. It was one of my last days on the job. It was not the last day. Actually, it was in February. Late January, early February, he tried to call me. So I don't remember the exact weekend in January when I saw the movie. But it was several days after that he tried to call me from Preston's office in Long Island, because he was quite mobile at the time. Would get in his car, drive out of the area where he's living, which is upstate New York, come down to the island, for various reasons, to see Preston. And at that time, when he goes back down there, he used to remember who he really was. And he wanted to call me. He didn't know where to reach me. Preston knew where I was. Preston called me, or attempted to, and the secretary at that time did not take a message that somebody's trying to call me all day, several times. And she did not take a message. Didn't let me know if somebody's trying to call me. I was in the lab all day, and finally I saw her late that afternoon. She said, "Oh, somebody's been trying to call you all day." I says, "Well, who was it?" "Oh, I don't know." And gave me the phone number. I believe she did at that time. And I called Preston that night. I says, "You were trying to get me all day." And he says, "Yes." I says, "Where were you?" I says, "I was in the lab." I says, "Didn't you get a message?" "No. No message was given me till I left." He says, "Well, von Neumann was here. He was trying to call you." And he says, "Oh, my God." So I knew at that point that he was involved, and he realized that my memory, don't ask me how he knew, but my memory had come back, unless it was the fact that he, like other people who time travel, suddenly became very psychic. And it might have been the reason why he remembered. I can only guess at that.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. So do you think von Neumann actually did a lot of time traveling himself?
Yes, he did. He did quite a bit. It was part of another phase of the, shall we say, the interim between the two experiments, that is, between Philadelphia and Montauk. When the two locked up, this is something which I mentioned before, when the two locked up, they created a problem. The problem was an enormous disturbance in the time field. The time field normally flows at an even rate, and like at a RF transmission line, which is driven at its characteristic impedance and terminated at its characteristic impedance, energy flows through that transmission line evenly without any reflection. If you change the terminal impedance to be unmatched, you get a reflection, a reflected wave that goes back to the source. You get standing waves as a result of this, and this, of course, is inefficient transmission. Eventually you get to the point where there's very poor transmission or none. The time field is very similar. If you produce a disturbance in the time field, or let's say the caliber and the size which was produced by the lockup of the Philadelphia experiment with the Montauk, you are disturbing, you might say, the characteristic impedance of the transmission of the time field, and it produces standing waves. And it did. And von Neumann knew this was happening, and he knew the next node point after 1943, which produced enough disturbance of its own at that point. And it was 1963, and he got together with some other scientists and realized if they didn't do something to damp this out in 63, they were going to have a very serious problem, like most of the North American continent was going to disappear. The rest would be, except for the mountain chains, would be underwater, ocean water. He knew this. He got a number of scientists together. I talked with one of the others who is from our time. The other two, number 3 and number 4, are from the future. I never found out who they were. And they engineered some equipment which was installed at Montauk in about May of 1963 to put Earth on a different timeline. Earth is not on the original timeline. And this is known in certain quarters. And there is efforts being made, or let us say promulgated, theorized that we should get Earth back on its original timeline. Not until after 2003, if at all.
So is there an Earth out there that's actually on our original timeline?
That's debatable, whether there's another Earth on the original timeline. This depends on how heavily you accept the idea of parallel realities and how real are parallel realities. I do know that equipment was built, and they did shift Earth off the original timeline, and what it did was provide an artificial damping through that period of August of 1963, so there was little or no disturbance.